This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Here we are. It's already October. I can't believe it. I hope you're enjoying some cooler temperatures wherever you are. I'm thrilled to have a dynamic team with us this morning. We have Amanda, Mitch, and Emily with Ironwood joining us, and we have some great hot topics that we're going to discuss. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join. Amanda's going to start us off with implications of workplace recordings, and she's also going to give a brief update on some overtime rulings that have yet to make their appearance. So welcome, Amanda, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. As Elizabeth mentioned, I know we've gotten a few questions. It's not been atypical. And again, you guys are always just ahead of the game here because we have been talking about the possible changes to the exemption law, to overtime rules. Really, I think since back in April, it might have even been March, because we were expecting to hear something from the government and to have updated regulations released. We said April, maybe May is what all the HR kind of gossip sites were saying. But still, as of this morning, there is no update on exemption. So just kind of as a brief background, what we were hearing was there was going to be some changes to the duties test. So when you looked at whether a new employee or an existing employee on their job description, whether or not they would be exempt from overtime versus non-exempt, or as a lot of times people say, salaried versus hourly, there is a bit of a difference, but we won't get hung up on that. And they were changing the reasons why someone could be exempt from overtime. And they were also going to potentially raise the salary threshold. Now it's about $36,000 per year. We don't know exactly what that number will be. Again, kind of rumors and gossip and speculation is it could go into the upper 40,000s. So as soon as we have some more information about this, we of course will be happy to share and discuss with you guys. The good news is there's no action required right now. And also just knowing that even when the new exemption rules are released, it won't be an immediate thing. There's often a lot of back and forth, a lot of explanation. You will have months to go through and audit your current employees and see if any changes are made. But hopefully we will have more information on that next month. So then switching gears a little bit, the first topic that we're going to talk about today is about office recordings. This is a question we get quarterly, every other month. It's not atypical, and it's always a little bit of a variation. And it centers on a few different things. It could be voice recordings, it could be video recordings. We've also gotten some about just name, image, likeness. So I'm going to start with a bit of background information about the language that's used and the rules and regulations that commonly apply. And then we'll break it down into some of the different scenarios that you might be likely to see or experience in your workplace. So kind of backing up a few steps, why would you need to make a recording in the office? And again, there's lots of reasons. Generally employers or the individual employees might have a need to record different conversations because it relates to the business, to customers, to different business dealings. It also could have to do with the employees. Again, we'll touch base on that in a minute. There are both federal and state laws regarding different types of recordings, and they both differ and are the same in some states. Texas's align pretty closely with the rules that Congress has put into place, but there are a few points that we want you to look out for, though, and ways that you could get tripped up with this. In general, most states, so 38 in the District of Columbia, are a one-party consent state. And so we're going to break that down here in just a minute. But keep that in mind as I'm talking more generally, that Texas does fall in this one-party consent category. Some states, the others, do require either both parties to consent, or everyone on the call to consent if it was multiple people. If you were to do a Google search, because you are just so excited about this topic and interested after we touch base today, and are looking for phone recordings or video recordings and want to see the actual laws related to this, you may have some difficulty coming up with the actual federal or state regulations. And that's because the language that they use when writing these laws is pretty specific. So I'm going to touch base on the three main terms that you might see or hear about, because that is the language that you would read if you actually went in and read the statute. So those words that we're going to be circling back to a few times today are eavesdropping, wiretapping, and intercepted communication. So if we're talking about recordings, I might be using one of these words instead, since that's what's technically in the different laws and regulations. So just something to keep in mind. Also, just another disclaimer overall is, of course, we are trying to interpret a lot of complicated regulations here to present information in a limited time period. If you are going to change company policy or are interested in adopting something different and are worried about consent or even just best practices, it is a good idea, especially if you operate in more than one state or have communications in more than one state or clients in more than one state, that you consider talking to an attorney as well before establishing a policy, just so that they can make sure that both states or multiple state laws are met and that federal law is met. So the biggest piece, which I've already mentioned a little bit, is the keyword of consent. Whether or not you can record the call or not, again, in Texas, it's one party. So if, let's say, two of us are on a telephone conversation, if I have given consent to record the call, that's all that you are required to do. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Outside of Texas, again, and those other 11 states, they may require both parties. But as long as I am a participant on the call, I can be the one person that consents to recording that. Where it gets trickier, as I've already mentioned, is what if you're talking to someone in another state? What if you're on a conference call and there are lots of states represented? Or what if there are people on a call that aren't participating? So they're not one of those necessarily that can grant consent. So let's work through those a little bit. So the general rule of thumb when thinking about whether you follow Texas's, for example, state laws, or whether you would follow a different state's regulations or the federal regulations is deferring to where the recording device is located. So if I was on the phone with somebody in New Mexico and I gave consent, New Mexico was a poor example because they're also one party, let's say Washington, because they're a two-party consent state. If I gave consent, I could record that call based on the recording device being here. Now, again, that's the general rule. If it's going to be a regular practice, it would be a pretty good idea to really become more familiar with, in this example, the Washington state law, since they are a two-party consent state. So there's some conflict there because the general rule here, or the general interpretation is, the recording device was here in Texas, so we're going to follow Texas law. Again, so if this is going to be a regular practice, it's probably something to dig in and do some research on, because there are some state laws that say that no, you shouldn't defer where the recording device is, you should defer to the state where the individual who is being recorded is at. So in this situation, which I arbitrarily chose Washington and am not incredibly familiar with their rules. So please, if you have this specific example, let's talk about it after the fact, because I probably misinterpreted their law when focusing on Texas's. But instead of being where the recording device is, where the individual is being recorded. Again, overall, our general suggestion, whether it be an example like this or whether you be on a call with multiple people from multiple states, is it's best practice just to obtain consent from everyone prior to recording the call. And that would speak true also if you're just talking to individuals here in Texas. Just let them know ahead of time this is going to be happening. Many of you, if you've used Zoom or Teams or something like that, where you would be recording that way, it does notify the individual it's going to be recorded. When you're looking at consent in and of itself, the one thing that you have to bear in mind is consent is not assumed to be given if there's been a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, that's one of those phrases that is specifically written into regulations, but is a little bit ambiguous, because what might be reasonable to me might be entirely different than what is reasonable to another employee or any of you guys on the line today. In general, courts have said that, that expectation should not be there for expected privacy if you're out in public. Again, that's pretty broad. And a lot of times it really will boil down to the more specific details of the situation, when, who, what, when, where, why. So we've got to dig into that a little bit more. If you are going to be on the call, let's say two individuals are on the call and you're the note taker, you're the third person, so you're not going to be participating, but you would be on the line. You are not one of the individuals that could fully give consent. If you're just there observing, it would need to be one of the two parties that is actively participating here in Texas, and again, under federal law. So now going back to those couple of words that I used at the beginning as the language used in the rules. The first was eavesdropping. And just as a random aside, this seems very obvious to say out loud to me, but I did not realize that eavesdropping that word came into existence because it was assumed back in olden times that this is when an individual would be listening outside of homes, under walls, under windows, or under the eaves of a house. And so that's where the term eavesdropping came from. But the actual definition now means to overhear, record, amplify, or transmit any part of the private communications of others without the consent of at least one of the persons engaged in communication. So a lot of what we've already been talking about, but again, eavesdropping is the language that you'll see if you're actually searching for technical words. So this could include things if you're in crime show mode or spy TV, picturing those things here after we're talking about eavesdropping. This could include things like planting a bug inside a private premises. It also could be wiring a government informant. All of those things, depending on the technicalities, may fall under the regulations for eavesdropping. Separately, there could also be wiretapping regulations. So that would be using more covert means to intercept and monitor communications. So this is an unauthorized physical connection between the sender of the message and the receiver of the message. And then if you're just talking generally about both, that could be intercepted communication. So that could be any acquisition of content, and that could be over the phone, electronic, or through oral conversation. So now that we've got the definitions down, again, we've talked a lot about consent without really defining what consent is. We've said that third person in the room that's not participating can't give it. A lot of the guidance out there interpreted from different rulings and legislation, rulings and regulations shows that consent can be implied, meaning that if you call up any service or any business and in their recording before you catch the person that you're trying to reach says, this call might be recorded for quality assurance or training purposes. The general understanding is if you remain on the line that you have given your consent to have the call recorded. That would work similarly in offices if you have let employees know that you could be recording, if it's an active policy in your handbook or that you have given out separate from that. If they have not declined or asked to speak to somebody with concerns and some sort of reason why this shouldn't apply to them, then it's assumed that they have given their consent. Now, of course, every state is going to have some exceptions to this. Just major semi-obvious solutions here. The police department, has different sets of rules, court orders, communication service providers, emergency services, anything like that. They're going to have a whole different set of regulations that is going to be different and outside of what we're discussing today. When you're thinking about how this might apply to your employees and your business, you do have to remember that monitoring of your employees is common and it's normally allowed as long as there's a business-related reason. Again, best practice is always going to be that you are notifying employees, again, whether through policy, handbook, or training, but that could cover it. If you have customers coming into your building and you have ongoing audio or video recording, it is a good idea to have something posted, whether it be on the front doors or in the lobby, again, notifying them that audio and or visual surveillance could be occurring. When you look to the Texas Workforce Guidance on video surveillance, they point you really back to a lot of the things that we've talked about telephone monitoring. That if it's only video and no audio, that actually consent is not required. But again, best practice would be to give notice to customers coming in. And that again would be kind of like that third person in the room taking notes. No one would be a secondary one party consenting to that video, which is why you would have to notify them. And then again, if they had the notification, it was readily available, it would be implied that if they are staying, they continue to consent. Again, if audio, let's say you have a camera system that has both audio and video, is going to take place, you do have to have that consent. It can't just be a posting. You would have to have a policy in place, practices in place. You would have to make sure that it's highly visible for customers and for employees so that truly consent can be given. And again, just to circle back, I've said it a couple of times, but best practice would be for employee morale and overall, just to avoid grumblings in general, would be, instead of being more covert about any type of surveillance, to be upfront with employees from day one, again, in their policy manuals or in orientation and training, and let them know what the current setup at the office location or at the work sites are. Obviously, you would never place videotapes in any areas where employees have that expectation of privacy. So restrooms, dressing rooms, sometimes there's gym facilities, in office spaces or in shared office spaces. Obviously, in those dressing areas, you wouldn't have any sort of video surveillance. And then the last key thing to remember from the Texas Workforce Commission is just making sure that you have a policy and procedure in place for who actually has the authorization to review that video. It can't just be that anyone can pull up the footage, that can be considered an invasion of privacy. So you would, of course, need to have that protected, not only so that it's encrypted and that data can't be shared or easily hacked into, but that individuals that only have a reason to review the footage have access to that. So then to just start to wrap up here and just touch on kind of the last couple of things to consider that commonly occur in the workspace. A lot of times companies have policies and apply this logic to computers and workstations. Again, this is a loose correlation to what we're talking about, but in general, employers can monitor activity on a workstation or on a computer. Again, you would want to inform employees of that beforehand, although it's not required. Again, best practice to let them know. Same with landline phones. We've talked pretty extensively about telephone communications, but again, when you're thinking about privacy laws and expectations of privacy and private versus public, as well as the idea being you would only be recording for business purposes, if it is on a landline and a personal call occurs, if an employee ends up getting a call from a family member, if you're actively monitoring the call, you would want to, however you can, whatever that looks like, stop recording the call and stop being on the line. Again, if it was just that all calls are recorded, you would obviously just want to try to delete that or not use that information against the employee. You would also just want to make sure that in your telephone policy or in your communications policy that it's either specifically prohibited that personal calls can be made on business lines, or again, speak to that it could be recorded. Same thing with mobile devices. There's a little bit of some different language that you would need with a company phone versus a bring your own device, mobile device. But again, you're going to want to inform the employees if you have to put any software on their phone, if you are going to be asking for any information or monitoring off of their phone, you would want to obtain consent and have an active policy and procedure in place. Company vehicles, again, we're going a little bit off the rails into the last couple of examples, but as far as recording, obviously that's going to differ between DOT and non-DOT driving, but it's very common to have some sort of GPS system on employer-owned vehicles. Again, you would just keep your staff members informed about that, and when they either sign the policy or the agreement for the company car, they would have that information presented to them as well. The last example is mail that might come into the office space. The expectation is that it's being sent to an employee at the workplace, that it is about work. So if there was a very limited fact-specific reason why that mail needed to be opened, it is possible that it could be done. But again, that's probably something that you'd want to consult with a legal professional with, just with the overlapping laws of recording versus consent versus it coming to the office itself, as well as just obviously the postal rules and regulations that most of us are familiar with about opening other people's mail. So the last thing I'd ask you to keep in mind about this too, that we have gotten a couple other calls about, is with more focus on individuals' names and image and likenesses, something that you might consider adding to either your new hire packet or your handbook would be something speaking to a media release or a likeness release. It probably would be best as a standalone policy, but what this would cover would be if you are taking photographs in the office that might be used on the website or on a job site that might be used for marketing later. If you're going to include some of your employees, best practice would suggest getting their consent for that and having them release any rights to that photo or to their likeness at work. It's a very limited chance that potentially they could come back if they were moved on from the company and ask for any sort of royalties. But again, it's one of those things that on the front end, it might just be easier to go ahead and plan for a release of all materials. So I know we've covered a lot of different things there in a short amount of time, but that's a little bit more information about the different types and ways that we could be recording employees in the workplace and different things you might need to consider. Again, if it's something that you want to come up with in a new policy, please give us a call and we're happy to talk through the different scenarios. And if you're working with different states, talk through those specifics as well versus my antidote there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily, and she's going to talk about orientation and onboarding. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Amanda. So yes, I'm going to cover onboarding and orientation strategies, completely switching gears. With that being said, as any professional knows, orientation and onboarding have many different directions that you could take it. So I'm going to try to stick to dialing in on some more in-person strategies, as well as some remote strategies that you could adapt for your company. As we all know, the hiring process can be tedious, especially since COVID. The job market has been on a wave of highs and lows in candidate pools. So one way to help ensure that you lower your turnover rate is by having a useful and streamlined orientation and onboarding process. If you work in an industry that has receptionists, hostesses, or someone that is the first person that customer comes in contact with, whether that be in person or over the phone, their demeanor sets the tone of your company. If you have a rude employee dealing with clientele over the phone, odds are that that client will not return. Same with the onboarding and orientation process. After the initial hiring, your company sets the tone for the new hire's career, just like that receptionist or hostess. If you have an efficient process and set the tone for your company positively, statistics show a good company employee onboarding process ensures 69% of employees stick around for up to 3 years on average, and that 20% of staff turnover occurs within the first 45 days of employment. So with all this in mind, you may wonder, what is the difference between onboarding and orientation? This can be a bit confusing as orientation is typically included in the onboarding process, but they're not interchangeable. Employee onboarding and orientation differ and complement each other, and there's value into leveraging both. So for orientation, this refers to the process of introducing new employees to their jobs, coworkers, and organizations by providing them with information regarding such items as policies, procedures, company history, goals, culture, work rules. This is where you would cover the employee handbook, job description, job expectations. Onboarding is a process by which new hires are integrated into the organization and includes an ongoing introduction to the organization's structure, vision, mission by providing key training and development opportunities. So, in a nutshell, onboarding describes a series of events that enable new employees to learn what they need to do to meet the responsibilities of their new role, while orientation, on the other hand, refers to the initial welcome a company provides to the new hire that is usually over the course of a single day and focuses on the company as a whole, whereas onboarding can last up to weeks and even a year and focuses on the new hire's role. So for example, Ironwood, we are a remote company and our onboarding process begins when we sign our offer letter. The company initiates new hire paperwork to facilitate, orders the technical equipment, gets proper tools in place to be ready for our first day. These are pivotal steps in the integration to the company. Then our first day arrives and one of our HR representatives initiates an hour-long discussion with a presentation on welcoming us. This presentation discusses our company's core values, introducing team leads from each department, and really just homing in on our culture. This focuses on the company and is considered orientation. Then this process is followed by another meeting in which we learn about Ironwood's systems and platforms used to perform our jobs. In-depth training occurs, and this is integrating us into the organization as training is ongoing and defined in the onboarding process. Now, keep in mind that your company more than likely already has standard operating procedures for onboarding and orientation processes, but 55% of businesses don't measure the effectiveness of their onboarding process. And with good onboarding processes, employees are 18 times more committed to their employer. So you may ask, what are some good steps for orientation? Now, orientation doesn't necessarily have to be conducted on the first day of employment, but should be within the first few days of the new hire's schedule. It is always a good rule of thumb to have a member of HR and or a company leadership lead orientation. Again, the tone of the company is being set, and what better way to set that tone than having a key member of your organization talk about the company in a positive light. This will set the expectation of the role correctly right out the gate. A useful strategy for orientation is to make sure the new hire is prepared prior to the orientation meeting or video call or whatever you set up for that orientation. Some steps could be directions on how to access orientation, the agenda and duration of orientation. You could supply specific items that they need to bring, such as like IDs or voided checks for direct deposit, or you could supply contact information for the individual or the team conducting orientation. These examples are just things that you could set the right path for the employee to have success during that orientation process. Next, having a checklist of all the things covered with that new hire is extremely useful to make sure that the key points are discussed during orientation and keep the process fluid and organized. So some of these items on the checklist could be an overview of your company's mission, values, vision, mandatory new hire paperwork, discussion for benefit plans, enrollment forms, a review of safety, health, security, any other critical procedures that may be in place for your organization, review of administrative procedures. You could have distribution of companies' materials, equipment, uniforms, key cards, laptops, anything that ensures success to their role. You could conduct guided tours for the workplace, conduct introductions to coworkers and other members of management, and you could have on your checklist required general training for employees on topics such as the Code of Business Conducts and ethical business practices. Or you could also have key organizational contacts such as designated HR representatives or IT members or your chain of command listed within the process of describing who is involved in your organization. Again, those are just some examples that you could have on the checklist. And again, it's just to kind of streamline the process and make it seem like you're more organized and you're hitting all the important topics to discuss to integrate that employee into your organization. If you're a remote company, obviously in-person is going to be way different than what remote would end up entailing. Again, you'd want to have the checklist of what you would go over, but you'll need to work harder at the outset to combat employee isolation. So you'll want to consider maybe sending new employees welcome packets in advance. These packets may include a small gift, orientation materials, or company branded merchandise. For example, Ironwood sent us a little welcome gift. Mine specifically included like little highlighters and notepads and like Ironwood branded merchandise. I know personally it was just a nice little touch and just made me already feel part of the team and welcomed. So that's definitely an idea to keep in mind for remote orientation. Set expectations for the virtual setting by suggesting attendees participate from distraction-free setting. This was recommended to me by a fellow coworker just to make sure that I could personally, throughout my orientation process, just stay focused. Obviously, a lot of information is given all at once and it's hard to retain sometimes. So just by suggesting that, we're in a distraction-free kind of setting and just really get our feet wet with the processes and everything happening until we can kind of really hone in on our own ways was very helpful. Another thing to consider for remote orientation would be suggesting to establish secure systems and settings so that the employees can safely transmit sensitive information containing their new hire paperwork. And a lot of times you are facilitating that voided check or the I-9 paperwork, and that has your social security. So just having a safe way to transmit this information right out the gate sets for a good tone with the organization. And then lastly, you could also just keep scheduling in mind. Sitting in virtual sessions for an entire day is different experience and sometimes more exhausting than being in person. So the schedule of both options might look different and that checklist may need to be adjusted. As far as employee onboarding, this is more of a strategic plan to help new hires understand their day-to-day responsibilities and work processes through meetings, starter projects, job-specific training, which can help identify areas for development. Remember, onboarding lasts over a period of time, so it is critical for managers to schedule regular check-ins for new hires so they can connect face-to-face and have an opportunity to share feedback. So a useful strategy for onboarding, again, like I mentioned, you could go many different strategies and whatever best fits your organization. So I'm going to speak to one that I utilized in my past with past roles, but we followed the 5 C's of onboarding. This is the way for the employee to be successful right out the gate. So the 5 C's stand for compliance, clarification, culture, connections, and check back. So compliance would be informing your new hire about your company's rules, policies, covering employee handbooks in depth. You should perform all the confidential paperwork, insurance policies, non-solicitation agreements, and any kind of paperwork that would need to be filled out prior to the rest of their onboarding. And remember, and maybe to lessen some confusion, orientation is a step in the onboarding process. And then the second C would be clarification. So this deals with the employee's awareness of the job and learning the responsibilities and expectations and covering the job description and be clear about what is expected for the new hire in regards to their new position with the company. Afford them the time to ask questions and better understand. This will allow for that open door communication and set the tone for the company and develop the culture and really kind of hone in on what your company is about to allow that open door to ask questions and just understand their role right out the gate. Another step in the 5 C's would be culture. This is an introduction to attract and retain. As it is said, and kind of how I mentioned previously, first impression is the last impression. So give your coworkers a fascinating culture introduction to become intrigued in your company. You can contrive the company's plans and objectives and include the company's vision and incentives to depict a positive impression. If the employee gets captivated by your company's culture, they become your loyal workers. Thus, the C in the onboarding process It will introduce your organization's motives effectively. Another step would be connections. This is affiliations with other teammates and senior authorities is essential for optimal consequences. I cannot speak today. As a manager, you must ensure an engaging connection with your newly hired team. A friendly relationship assists workers in completing tasks enthusiastically. You can follow various steps to improve your connection with the new staff. You can schedule meetings, lunches, seminars, multiple ways that you connect with them, one-on-ones, group meetings, anything like that. The interrelation helps the team to acclimate to the company efficiently. In this way, the new hire feels included and appreciated. Research shows that 35% of employees quit their jobs due to boredom of the role. So a good collaboration between mentors and newcomers validate the success of your business. And lastly, that last step in the 5C of onboarding would be the check back. As if you're in any position of leading a team, you know that follow through is the most important. This gives the employee the sense of you're wanting to invest in them, and you can include them in this process by scheduling sequential meetings after weeks to evaluate their performance. 78% of employees report that they would remain with the company longer if they have a clear path within the current organization. So the evaluation period allows for that growth, and they are more likely to retain within your company. Overall, the 5 C's of orientation and onboarding reinforce your company's workforce and make for a worthy onboarding plan. If your company is remote, some ideas for an effective onboarding process include pre-recorded welcome videos with an introduction from each team member that appears in the new employee's email on their first day. You could have team-wide welcome meetings over video conference. You could do virtual team building that occurs regularly. You could hold virtual lunches or happy hours, book clubs, regular check-ins between managers and the new employees via video conference for virtual coaching, for sharing feedback, and also just to get to know each other and build that rapport would be a really good way to have effective onboarding process if you were to be remote. So at the end of the day, the onboarding process gives the employee the tools, resources, and connections they need to be successful within their role. The amount of time that takes can range from 3 weeks to 6 months or up to the year. This really just depends on the individual and their role. For me personally, as a key member of leadership in my past roles, I would personally conduct the onboarding process. As a company, we would keep in mind that each employee is going to require specific needs, as some are visual learners, some learn by doing, some learn by hearing. So throughout the onboarding experience and the set training tools we had in place, we were able to adhere to all types of learning. So we had videos to conduct pieces of training, such as any kind of anti-bullying or harassment kind of training, and just in general training geared toward their specific role. So we would have like training manuals and videos they could go through. The training videos would be interactive, so the new hire would be engaged and then have follow-up quizzes to occur. This allowed for the new hire to grasp and retain the information being taught and test their skills and allow management to adjust to their learning needs and just really gain that buy-in essentially and showing that the company is investing. All in all, strategic employee onboarding continues to be a key focus for many organizations. Companies that invest in improving an onboarding experience are more likely to see key benefits, such as increased engagement levels, decreased time and proficiency, and decreased turnover rates. Obviously, again, to kind of hit on that point, there are tons of different ideas that you could utilize for onboarding and orientation strategies. And that pretty much concludes everything that I have to say. I know it was a lot thrown at you guys, but I really appreciate your time. I am going to pass it over to Mitch.
Thanks, Emily. So we're going to jump into contesting unemployment claims. We'll go ahead and dive right into it, but we're going to cover kind of going from the initial notification on up through determining whether or not you should challenge it, what sort of considerations to keep in mind, some common mistakes, as well as some best practices to hopefully help out in the future. But typically you'll receive a questionnaire, it's commonly called a separation report, that'll be requesting some additional details from the employer to assist in making the initial determination. They might also invite you to participate in a hearing to help determine whether or not that claim should be rewarded. So first step, you're going to want to verify the details of the claim. Check to ensure that the individual in the claim was or is an employee of your organization. Sometimes you'll get them if you have temporary staffing agency employees or independent contractors. They'll send it to the employer they're working at and not the employer that they're actually on the payroll for. So it's always a good idea to just double check that. You'll also want to verify any data that's on there. These will include things like wages, dates of employment, any severance or vacation payouts, or any other information that they request. You'll also want to take a look at the details surrounding the event that caused the claim. So generally, it'd be the details of the termination, if it's a resignation, things like that. Another thing to keep in mind is that employees can also receive partial unemployment if they've changed their status from full-time to part-time. So once you've taken a look at that, you're going to want to determine whether or not you want to contest the claim. One of the first things you're going to want to look at is whether or not there's a legitimate basis for the unemployment claim. So each state's a little bit unique, but typically the employee will have a right to unemployment if they lost their job through no fault of their own. So if it was a thing like a layoff or something like that, or their hours have been restricted through no fault of their own. So let's say you're working with a client decides to cut hours, so the employee moves to part-time through no fault of their own. However, the employee can lose their right to unemployment in situations where they voluntarily resign. There are certain exceptions to that though. So things like disability, relocation, if they're experiencing harassment and it's an unsafe work environment, that could constitute what's considered quitting with good cause. So the employee would still be eligible for unemployment. Or cases where the employee is engaged in willful misconduct that's resulted in the loss of their job. Another big one that I used to have to deal with quite a bit was also refusing offers of work. Those can get a little bit tricky, but that is another way that the employee could potentially be disqualified. So for misconduct cases, you're going to want to prove that their actions constituted a violation of a rule, policy, or law that was within the claimant's power to control or avoid. So typically they'll look for things like gross misconduct. So it had to be something the employee knew that they were doing wrong, that had a significant business impact. So kind of your big ticket items that somebody would know that they were going to be separated for. The claimant, you also want to keep in mind that the claimant should be separated for a specific incident that occurred close to the time of discharge. So typically you want to avoid situations where you're firing somebody for, hey, they were just a bad employee for the last 6 months and we finally pulled the plug. You want to try and pinpoint a specific incident that you'll be able to defend potentially during the hearing. You'll also want to be able to prove that the claimant knew or should have known that their actions would result in discharge. So if it's not something in their handbook that mentions that they could be disciplined for it and you decide to fire them for it, it'll be pretty tough to try and sit there and defend it. So another consideration is, does challenging it make sense? While you're going through looking at your documentation, you want to see if there's any information that, if revealed, could have a negative impact moving forward. It's also a good idea to look at whether or not the time cost will outweigh the benefit of contesting it. If you don't really have anybody available and you're going to need to pull half your team as witnesses, it may not be as beneficial to contest it as opposed to just letting it go. You also want to keep in mind whether or not you have the documentation to support the challenge. So with my previous company, one of the things that we would run into a lot were refusal of work, where an employee would file for unemployment because we weren't able to get them placed at a client site, but we wouldn't have any documentation to show that they'd actually refused an offer. In situations like that, we just didn't have the documentation to support fighting it. So a lot of the time we wouldn't. Another thing to keep in mind is, will fighting the claim result in more litigation from the employee? Some circumstances, you'll have somebody who's particularly disgruntled. It may be more beneficial to let them take the unemployment, try and get them to move on and forget about the company rather than dig in, contest the claim, risk giving them more ammunition against the company and risk further litigation. So it's just something to keep in mind. From there, you're going to want to start gathering your evidence. So for resignations or voluntary reductions in hours, try to get a copy of the resignation letter. Try to get documentation showing that the employee had requested that reduction in hours. Whatever documentation you have, you're going to want to gather that up. For terminations, you're going to want to look for things like the disciplinary history, any policy acknowledgements, Handbook acknowledgement was one of the first things that I would pull anytime I was looking at contesting it, to make sure that the employee knew the policy that they had violated, not just for the termination, but potentially for the unemployment as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that information or that evidence should be sent to the unemployment office. If things end up going through a hearing or an appeal, that information will be sent to the claimant so that they can review the evidence before the hearing. So it's always a good idea to keep in mind that that's going to occur. I ended up getting into a situation early on in my HR career where I'd sent in an unredacted use of force report as part of an unemployment claim. That listed every witness, every member of the board, the client points of contact, what their voting results were. Long story short, that was sent to the claimant. He ended up sending about a 30-page email to our client and everybody listed in there, basically spelling out all of his grievances. It ended up creating kind of a significant impact with our client relationship as a result. So it's just something to keep in mind. So as far as moving forward to the hearing itself, it's always a good idea to be prepared, have your documentation readily available so that you can refer back to it. You always want to be on time and try to be mindful and remove emotion. You want to be professional. At the end of the day, you're there representing your company. You also want to be concise when you're answering questions. So try to stick to the facts that led to the termination. You want to try and defend the final incident, not necessarily everything leading up to it. So the way you go about that is, instead of saying, hey, for the last 6 months, this employee's been terrible, you want to pinpoint it on, hey, we went through our progressive disciplinary, there were previous issues, we issued the first written warning on this date, second written warning, final incident was issued on this date. And then after that, the behavior continued, which is why we separated on this date, stemming from the final incident. So there are some common mistakes that can cause some issues with the unemployment claims based on a discharge. Failing to give a final warning prior to discharge is a big one. Again, progressive disciplinary is becoming more and more important, so it's always a good idea to keep that in mind and have a good, solid progressive disciplinary process in place. Inconsistent discipline between two similarly situated employees. So if you have two employees who one of them was terminated for it, one of them received a warning, you're going to want to be able to articulate why that occurred. So if one had multiple offenses and they'd already been issued a final, be able to articulate that. But if it's just two of them for their first offense, one gets termed, one doesn't, you're going to have issues there. Failing to follow your stated disciplinary policy is another big one. If it's in there and it says that somebody gets a warning for it, terming on the first offense, probably not a good idea. Telling the TWC or the Texas Workforce Commission that the claimant was fired for an accumulation of incidents instead of the specific final incident. When you start getting into those generalities, it becomes harder to defend. If you struggle in one area, that may lead them to throw out the entire argument. You want to avoid letting too much time pass between the final incident and the discharge. So if somebody had an issue 2 months ago and you decide to finally terminate them for it, it's going to be hard to defend. Saying that the claimant's unable to satisfy performance standards. You need to be able to articulate why. Don't be general. You want to be specific with your defense. Allowing the impression that the discharge was really based on a personality dispute. Again, it should be based on policy violations. And then not being able to properly defend the termination, so not having firsthand witnesses or proper documentation when needed. So with resignations, it's always a good idea to look into why the employee is leaving. So if you're not inquiring into why an employee wants to quit, that could create issues if there's things like harassment going on that led to them leaving and you fail to investigate. Which ties into another one. If you're allowing coworkers and supervisors to harass an employee or engage in unsafe conduct, creating an unsafe work environment, that may be grounds for the employee to win unemployment. So it's a good idea to nip those issues in the bud early on. Explaining that the resignation was a result of mutual agreement. Again, even if the employee decides to resign, if you decide to not have them work their notice period and separate immediately, that could potentially turn the resignation into a discharge, which would allow the employee to be eligible for unemployment. So it's always a good idea that if you decide to do something like that, make sure that you either get an adjusted resignation letter, something like that, to show that ultimately it was the employee's decision. When you're presenting your case on a resignation, it's also a good idea to be mindful that you want it to stay a resignation. So you don't want to communicate anything that could make it seem like the employee was discharged. So if the claimant quit after it became clear that they were just not up to the job, that makes it sound like, oh, well, the employee was kind of pressured into quitting. So you just want to focus on, they left for personal reasons, things like that. So as far as best practices, one of the key things you're going to want to keep in mind is making sure that your policies and processes are squared away. At the end of the day, doing the legwork up front is going to save you a lot of headaches when it comes time to actually deal with the unemployment claims. So making sure that you have good progressive disciplinary policy in place, making sure your policies are up to date and that they articulate the potential outcomes for violating them. Making sure that you have good documentation. So even if somebody verbally resigns, go back and get it in writing. Even if it's something like they send you an email or a text message, you can use that to show that, hey, this actually occurred. It was a resignation. Same thing with terminations. Writing a good investigation summary is key. Being able to articulate why you reached that conclusion to separate. Making sure that it states that final incident that led to the separation. If there are concerns that are brought forward, make sure that you investigate those promptly. Particularly if an employee is bringing forward something like harassment, discrimination, or an unsafe work environment. Dig into that, start investigating it. That way, if they do end up resigning over it, you can show that you looked into it, you addressed it, and that'll give you better grounds to try and contest it. Another big one, like I mentioned before a couple times, you don't want to turn a resignation into a termination. So if they're resigning, make sure that you have a solid process in place for that. And above all, you don't want to miss deadlines. They'll give you a deadline to respond. If you need an extension, each state has a process for that. So it's always a good idea to be mindful of those deadlines so that you don't miss them and forfeit your your eligibility to contest the claim. So that's kind of a quick rundown on unemployment claims. If you have any questions on it when you're going through them, each case can be a little bit different. Feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help and talk through it. But that's what I've got on my end. Any questions?
Thanks, Mitch. No, we haven't received any questions. And like Mitch stated, it's kind of case by case. And so we do encourage you to take time to fill out that agreement. If you haven't gotten that agreement in place yet as a client of ours, I can help with that process. And in my follow-up email, I'll share that agreement again as well. It is something great to take advantage of and get in place prior to a crisis or a high need. I always say it's best, and it helps just with the process not to have to be doing that when everyone's stressed out over a situation. So I so appreciate y'all's time today. Great information was shared. And if I do receive any questions, I'll send those. And I'll be sending out the recording this week if you want to share it internally with any of your staff members. But wishing y'all a great week, and we will see y'all in November. Thanks.